Hi, my name is Shannon, and along with my group members Islam, Layal, and Shantell, our group will be investigating the conspiracy theory: was Marilyn Monroe murdered?
Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Janae Morrison on June 1st, 1926, in Los Angeles. She grew up in a life marked by instability. Her mother struggled with mental illness, and she spent most of her childhood in foster homes and orphanage. She married young at 16 to avoid returning to the foster care system, but her marriage ended when she began modeling during World War II. She rose to fame in the late 1940s and 1950s, becoming one of the Hollywood's most bankable stars and global sex symbol. Many critics often underestimated her acting abilities. However, she worked so hard to be able to be recognized as more than just a glamorous figure. Her personal life was equally famous, including marriages to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio and playwright Arthur Miller. Despite her fame, Monroe faced mental health struggles, anxiety, and insomnia, which often relied on prescription drugs. She also faced constant pressure from the media, the system, the studio system, and the public. However, on August 5th, 1962, she was found dead at her Brentwood home at age 36 from overdose. While her death was officially ruled as a probable suicide, her status as a cultural icon and the mystery surrounding her final hours have made her life and death a lasting subject fascination. To fully understand the conspiracy theory around the Marilyn Monroe's death, we need to look closely at the political and social climate of her time. The early 1960s were dominated by the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Just a month after her death, the Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. The lingering effects of the Red Scare meant that fear of communism still shaped U.S. politics. The House Un American Activities Committee had already targeted many in Hollywood for alleged communist ties, leading to too many blacklists and ruined careers. An example of that would be Monroe's third husband, Arthur Miller, which was one of those called before HOAC, which drew government security to her as well. The FBI kept files on Monroe citing her association with left leaning intellectuals, artists, and union activists. Her political involvement, including attending rallies and supporting civil rights causes, which in the atmosphere of the Cold War paranoia could attract some sort of suspicion. Her alleged romantic relationship with President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy further raised her profile in political circuses. In an area when the image of presidency was tightly controlled, a public scandal involving Monroe could have been damaging for them. Some theories suggest that she was seen as a liability, someone who might speak out about private conversation or sensitive public matters to others. Against this backdrop of Cold War tension, government surveillance, and political scandal, Monroe's sudden death became fertile ground for speculation. While no conclusive evidence has proven foul play, the intersection of her celebrity, political connection, and the national security climate keeps the conspiracy theory alive to this day.
Content of the conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories claim Monroe's death was a murder made to look like a suicide. Political connections. She was silenced because of her alleged affairs with President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. Mafia involvement. She had ties to the mob and was a liability. Murdered by her psychiatrist. Dr. Ralph Greenson killed her by request of Robert Kennedy due to her connection to the Kennedys. Inconsistencies in police reports and timelines. There was a delayed emergency response time, no pill residue found in her stomach, reports of unusual activity at her home before her death, and a possible staging of her death.
So, throughout our research, while we could not find any proven evidence that this conspiracy claim is accurate, we did find several inconsistencies in the case and in the timeline that are backed by substantial eyewitness testimonies that support them as potential evidence. The first inconsistency or premise one is that the medical examiner on the case, Thomas Noguchi, found no traces of barbiturates, which is the drug that Monroe was taking at the time of her death, in her stomach during his autopsy. This supports premise 2, which is also sub-conclusion 1, which is that Marilyn Monroe didn't die by an accidental overdose. Premise 3 is that there are multiple independent witnesses that place both Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy and Peter Lawford in LA, which is where Marilyn Monroe's house was, on the day of her death, instead of in San Francisco, which is where the conspiracy theory posits that they were actually lying about being on the day of her death. And this premise is backed by multiple codependent premises, such as premise 4, which has eyewitness reports of Lawford being seen at the 20th Century Fox lot, which is located in LA on the day of her passing. Premise 5, which is that Lawford and RFK were pulled over in LA on the day of her passing by a police officer named Lynn Franklin. And premise 6, which has multiple witness accounts saying that Lawford and RFK went to Marilyn Monroe's house earlier in the day, on the day that she died, all supporting the fact that they couldn't have been in San Francisco when she passed away. Premise 7 is that Lawford is the only eyewitness who said that she sounded depressed and suicidal on the day that she passed away. Other friends who spoke to her on that day said that she sounded fine, or that she sounded happy. One person is Joe DiMaggio Jr., her ex-husband. And all of these premises together support the main conclusion of this conspiracy theory, which is that Marilyn Monroe's death was not suicide, but it was actually a murder cover-up.
The mystery surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death on August 5, 1962, continues to fuel several conspiracy theories despite the cause of her death being ruled probable suicide. However, there are several strong arguments and evidence that contradict the claims of murder and proves that her death was an accidental overdose or suicide. One of the most interesting arguments against murder comes from the autopsy findings and subsequent medical opinions. Marilyn Monroe was discovered lifeless with an empty bottle of Nembutal beside her. The toxicology report found fatal levels of pentobarbital, Nembutal in her liver, and chloral hydrate in her blood. A purplish discoloration of the colon was discovered and pointed by some as a sign of barbiturate overdose. This was possibly administered by enema. The deputy medical examiner, Thomas Noguchi, stated in a 1986 interview that Monroe's stomach was empty, which is typical for bariatric abuse, as the drugs quickly passes into the small intestine. Noguchi also mentioned that he did not find needle marks and believed that the drugs were swallowed. He did consider the possibility of injections in hard-to-detect areas or a healing injection site from her therapist 24 hours prior. However, he found no evidence to support this claim. It is crucial to note that Noguchi later expressed immense regret that not all specimens were tested and that some organs were disposed of, therefore contributing to the ongoing murder theories. Furthermore, Monroe's known personal struggles and history of substance abuse provide context in relation to an overdose, whether it was intentional or accidental. She also had a documented history of struggling with drug and alcohol abuse. Likewise, she was also known to stage suicide attempts to seek attention. Surrounding medical discussions suggest that she suffered from gynecological issues, circadian rhythm sleep disorder, and anxiety disorders with imbalances in prostaglandins and oxytocin, which contributed to her insomnia and gynecological symptoms. Her use of alcohol and barbiturates may have worsened these physiological imbalances. In relevance, director John Huston, who worked with Monroe, believed her death was an accident. He further stated that she had taken too many sleeping pills when no one was there to intervene, which as a result was a mistake she had made and received emergency treatment for before. Also, biographer Donald Spottle also suggested that it could have been an accidental death due to an adverse reaction to drugs that were administered by enema. Another compelling argument against murder claims is the weather effect, which describes a phenomenon of copycat suicides that is in relation with highly publicized celebrity deaths. Marilyn Monroe was a worldwide symbol, and her death was widely publicized. In the 2 months after her death, there was a significant increase of 303 active suicide deaths in the United States and 6 in the United Kingdom that shows a psychic contagion. This further suggests that her death was perceived as a suicide, and as a result, influenced vulnerable people to imitate the act. This goes to show the strong public and psychological impact of her overdoses rather than a concealed murder. In contrast, many conspiracy theories surrounding Monroe's death was further advanced by male reporters and theorists, which in this case tend to contextualize her as a pawn in larger schemes like those involving in the Kennedys, the CIA, or the Chicago mob. Such narratives often reduce Monroe to a disposable asset or like a victim of male possessiveness and temper instead of acknowledging her too as an autonomous person. The general understanding of conspiracy theories showcase that they usually arise from a desire to make sense of the uncertain or like the fearful situations, which leads to illusionary power perception and over-attribution of agency where none exists. This underestimates the role of accidents, human error, and chance. Although there are various murder theories that involve the Kennedys to silence her about her affairs, and also like confidential government information and the mafia to prevent fear from revealing their operations, or like the CIA because she somewhat knew too much about aliens, the evidence presented against the murder claims usually points back to the medical findings, expert opinions, and the psychological impact of her celebrity status, which led to an accidental or intentional self-harm.
The argument that Marilyn Monroe was actually murdered is a prime example of an inductive argument because this argument is drawing conclusions from several eyewitness testimonies, observations, and other circumstantial evidence that can only suggest that it was a murder, not guarantee it. There is still the option for other possibilities, such as an accidental death that was not an overdose or death by natural causes. Therefore, we will be evaluating this argument using the acceptability and relevancy tests. Premise 1, which was that the autopsy didn't find any pills in her system at the time of death, is unacceptable because the medical examiner on the case, Thomas Noguchi, did find evidence of barbiturates, the drug that the actress was taking, in her stomach during his autopsy. Therefore, there is no current evidence to prove that this claim is accurate, and therefore it is not relevant. The second premise, subconclusion 1, is a codependent premise with premise 1. Therefore, because it is unacceptable and irrelevant, so is premise 2. Premise 3, which is that multiple independent witnesses placed both RFK and Peter Lawford in LA, where Monroe's house was, on the day of her death, on its own isn't acceptable. It needs other acceptable and relevant codependent premises, P4, P5, and P6. So when we look at P4, which is that Lawford was seen at the 20th Century Fox lot on the day of her death, this is a questionable premise because even if he was seen at the lot on the day of, it does not guarantee that he was at Monroe's house after, as it is only about a 15-minute drive to his beach house from the lot. Therefore, it doesn't mean that he was at the lot because he was at Monroe's house. It was convenient for his location too. Therefore, this is also an irrelevant argument. Premise 5, which is that Lawford and RFK were pulled over by a police officer in LA on the day of her death, is unacceptable because we were unable to find any public record of this traffic stop. Therefore, because it fails this test, it also fails the relevancy test. And premise 6, which is that multiple witnesses saw Lawford and RFK go to Monroe's house earlier in the day she died, is also unacceptable because some of those key witnesses, one being the maid, have later said that their claim was actually false and that they only said this to cover up the true circumstances of Monroe's death because her death was very public and talked about in the media, and there are negative stigmas with mental health and substance use issues. And so they wanted to cover that up, and they fed into the conspiracy theory. Because of this, it fails the acceptability test and also the relevancy test, and therefore Premise 3 becomes unsupported, and it fails those tests as well. Lastly, premise 7 is that Lawford is the only one that we could find on record saying that she sounded depressed and suicidal. Other eyewitness testimonies from her other friends that had spoken on the day she died said that she sounded fine and happy and was talking about her future plans, one of those being her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio Jr. Additionally, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI at the time, had ordered and seized all of the incoming phone records to Monroe's house after her death, and these were never released to the public, meaning that without any evidence, this claim fails the acceptability test and therefore also the relevancy test. And therefore, because all 7 premises fail the acceptability and the relevancy testing, the main conclusion, which is that Marilyn Monroe's death was not a suicide but actually a murder, becomes completely unsupported and fails the sufficiency test for the entire argument.
Firstly, the theory that the Kennedys did it. This theory suggests that President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy were complicit in Monroe's death, or at least in inducing her suicide to silence her about affairs and confidential government information she allegedly kept in a little red book. One key premise is a partially redacted FBI document that was discovered by a filmmaker, which suggested Robert Kennedy's complicity. This is an appeal to the document, but it's a reenaction and the context makes it direct support for the claim questionable. Another premise involves allegations by wiretrapper Bernard Spindle, who claimed to have heard a fight in a loud bang between Robert Kennedy, Monroe, and Peter Lawford. But his recordings were somewhat seized and destroyed. The destruction of this alleged evidence means we cannot assess its accessibility or relevance. Overall, this theory relies on unverified or unverifiable claims. For a conclusion as strong as murder or induced suicide, exceptionally strong evidence is required, which is not sufficiently provided here. Next, the sensational claim that the mafia did it. This theory argues that Chicago mafia boss Sam Giancana ordered Monroe's murder because she was threatening to blow the lid off his operations. The PI is basically the biographer Darwin Porter, who details a gruesome method of murder involving chloroform and a barotrue enema, which was carried out by 5 mafia hitmen. Porter also suggests the second premise that the Kennedys might have hired the mob. An expert testimony can be acceptable, however, the extraordinary and graphic detail of these claims, also coupled up with the reliance on a single biographer without additional corroboration, makes them questionable and lacking independent support. The means of death are not supported by the autopsy report even, which also mentions barotrue roots, but no evidence of enema or chloroform. The premises do not provide sufficient evidence to support the conclusion of mafia involvement. Then we encounter one of the nuttier theories, that she knew too much about aliens. This theory suggests Monroe was murdered by the CIA because she possessed this top secret information about the 1947 Roswell UFO crash, which was obtained through pillow talk with JFK and was planning to reveal it at a press conference. The main premise is an alleged classified CIA memo, which was produced by conspiracy theorist Dr. Stephen Greer. The term alleged and the source's context as a conspiracy theorist immediately renders this premise highly questionable, if not unacceptable, as it lacks the evidence and goes against general knowledge. Without an acceptable source, the entire argument just crashes. This conclusion demands extremely strong support, which is entirely not there. At last, the theory that she's still alive. This claim suggests Monroe's death was staged, and she was turned into a mental institution, where a hitchhiker in Nova Scotia, whom is the author John Alexander Baker believes was Monroe when he came across her, despite her mental state making her story hard to believe. The premise that her psychiatrist committed her or turned her in, and then the second premise is bigger accounts of finding her rely on a single self-published author's claims based on an encounter with an individual described as a paranoid schizophrenic. This is an appeal to an unreliable authority and an internally inconsistent claim where she was murdered and faked her own death. This goes against direct evidence of her body being found in an official autopsy report. These claims are unacceptable as they literally contradict overwhelming evidence and common knowledge. So when we look at these theories through the lens of critical reasoning, they consistently fall short in the test of accessibility, relevance, and sufficiency. These premises are questionable due to lack of credible support, and they usually just contradict accepted facts. It's crucial to remember that such theories thrive in societal crisis, like Monroe's sudden tragic death, because they provide simplified explanations for this complex and definitely emotionally distressing events, which fulfills this desire to make sense of the world and also address feelings of uncertainty or lack of control. Our minds are kind of super pattern recognition machines, which tend to find connections even when they're illusionary. Furthermore, these narratives surrounding Monroe's death are filtered through a male gaze, which always argue and put her as dependent upon or at the mercy of the men around her. This tends to put her as a disposable asset instead of acknowledging her self-made career and agency. By looking at these arguments, we see that the mystery of Marilyn Monroe's death continues to fascinate us. The popular conspiracy theories surrounding it are not supported by sufficient, acceptable, and relevant evidence. They're just compelling narratives, but they do not provide a sound basis for belief.
After reviewing all the evidence, it's clear that the theory that Marilyn Monroe was murdered does not hold up. Her autopsy confirmed a fatal overdose of barbiturate that was medically documented cause of death. She also had a long history of mental health struggles and past suicide attempts, which provides important context. There was no physical or forensic evidence of foul play, no wounds, no signs of struggle, and the claims about her knowing government secrets, there's no reliable proof, just speculation. In the end, all signs point to a tragic overdose, not a conspiracy. We believe the theory is false.